On a bitter January morning in 2001, in a modest apartment complex on the eastern edge of Denver, Colorado, a young woman named Melissa Hoover failed to show up for her shift at the Cherry Creek Mall. Her manager called twice, no answer. By noon, her roommate returned home to find the door slightly ajar, Melissa's purse on the kitchen counter, her keys in the bowl by the door, her winter coat still hanging on the rack. But Melissa was gone. The apartment was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the drip of a bathroom faucet. There were no signs of struggle, no broken glass, no overturned furniture, just an eerie, complete absence. 23 years would pass before anyone understood what happened in that apartment, and when the truth finally emerged, it would tear through a community that thought it had moved on. The question that haunted Denver for more than 2 decades was simple and terrible. Where was Melissa Hoover? Denver, in 2001, was a city caught between identities. The tech boom had brought wealth to certain neighborhoods, while others remained stubbornly working class. Their brick apartment buildings and corner bodegas untouched by the new money flowing through downtown. The Parkview Gardens apartment complex sat in one of these unchanged pockets, a cluster of 2-story buildings arranged around a central courtyard where residents parked their cars. The complex was not fancy, vinyl siding in beige and brown, metal railings painted forest green, small concrete stoops where people left their shoes and potted plants that never quite thrived in the thin mountain air. Melissa Hoover was 24 years old that winter. She had moved to Denver from Kansas 2 years earlier with dreams of becoming a fashion buyer. But like many young people drawn to the city, she found the reality more difficult than the vision. She worked retail at Nordstrom, lived paycheck to paycheck, and shared a cramped 2-bedroom apartment with her roommate, Angela Chen, whom she'd met through a Craigslist ad. Those who knew Melissa said she was reliable to a fault. She arrived 15 minutes early to every shift. She paid her half of the rent on the first of each month, sometimes earlier. She called her mother in Topeka every Sunday evening at 7 o'clock. Angela worked nights as a server at a downtown restaurant and usually got home around 2 in the morning. Their schedules rarely overlapped, but they left each other notes on the kitchen counter, small mundane messages about whose turn it was to buy milk or whether the landlord had fixed the heater. On the morning of January 19th, Angela had left such a note before heading to bed around 3 a.m. "Used the last of the coffee, sorry. We'll grab more tomorrow. Hope your shift isn't too crazy." Melissa's shift at Nordstrom was scheduled to begin at 10 o'clock that Friday morning. She typically woke at 7:30, showered, made toast and coffee, and left the apartment by 9:15 to catch the bus on Colfax Avenue. The route took 40 minutes with 2 transfers. She had done it hundreds of times. Angela woke that afternoon around 1 o'clock to the sound of her phone ringing. She ignored it. It rang again, then again. Finally, she answered. It was Melissa's manager from Nordstrom, a woman named Patricia who sounded more confused than angry. "Is Melissa sick?" Patricia asked. "She didn't call in. She's not answering her phone. Is everything okay?" Angela sat up. Melissa never missed work without calling. She padded out of her bedroom, still in her pajamas, and immediately saw Melissa's coat, then her purse, then her keys. The bathroom door was open. The shower was dry. Melissa's bed was made, the way she always left it, the blue comforter pulled tight with hospital corners. But Melissa's work clothes, which she always laid out the night before, were still draped over the chair in her room. Angela called Melissa's cell phone. It rang once, then went to voicemail. She called again. Same thing. She checked the apartment more carefully. Melissa's wallet was in her purse with her driver's license and debit card. Her toothbrush was in the cup by the sink. Her winter boots were by the door. Angela tried to think of a logical explanation. Maybe Melissa had met someone. Maybe she'd stayed somewhere else. But that didn't explain why her coat was here, or why she would leave for a date or a friend's place without her purse. Clear as throat, Angela called the Denver Police Department at 1:47 p.m. The dispatcher took her information, and told her that adults missing for less than 24 hours were not typically considered emergencies unless there were signs of foul play or the person was particularly vulnerable. Angela insisted something was wrong. The dispatcher said she would send an officer to take a report. Officer James Denton arrived at 2:30. He was in his early 40s, a 15-year veteran of the Denver Police Department who had worked everything from traffic stops to domestic violence calls. He took notes as Angela walked him through the apartment, showing him Melissa's belongings, her made bed, her untouched work clothes. Officer Denton asked the questions he always asked. Had Melissa been depressed? Had she mentioned wanting to leave? Were there any problems with boyfriends, family members, money? Angela said no to all of it. Melissa was stable, happy, even. She had been talking about saving up for a better apartment, maybe taking some community college classes. Officer Denton examined the front door. The lock was intact. No scratches around the deadbolt, no sign that it had been forced. The door had been slightly open when Angela came home, but that could mean anything. Maybe Melissa had left in a hurry and not pulled it closed completely. Maybe she was testing whether she'd locked it and forgot to shut it again. Officer Denton photographed the apartment, the purse, the keys. He took Angela's statement and told her to call him immediately if Melissa showed up or contacted anyone. He filed his report that evening, classification, missing person, adult, non-suspicious circumstances. But Angela couldn't sleep that night. She lay in her bed listening to the sounds of the apartment complex. Footsteps on the stairs, car doors closing, the distant bark of a dog. She kept expecting to hear Melissa's key in the lock, her cheerful voice calling out hello. The apartment felt different without her. Too quiet, too still. By Saturday morning, when Melissa still hadn't returned, Angela called Melissa's mother in Kansas. The conversation was brief and terrible. Melissa's mother, Barbara Hoover, caught the next flight to Denver. Part 2. The investigation, the search for Melissa Hoover, began in earnest on Sunday, January 21st, 48 hours after she was last seen. Barbara Hoover arrived at the Denver Police Department's District 2 station that morning with photographs of her daughter, phone records she had requested from Melissa's cell provider, and a list of everyone Melissa knew in Colorado. Barbara was a paralegal, methodical and precise, and she demanded that the police treat her daughter's disappearance as more than a young woman who had wandered off. Detective Sarah Campos was assigned to the case. She was 36, sharp-eyed and thorough, known in the department for her patience with details that other investigators found tedious. She interviewed Angela Chen again, this time at the station, going through every moment of the days leading up to Melissa's disappearance. Had Melissa mentioned feeling followed? Had she noticed anyone unusual in the apartment complex? Had she been dating anyone? Angela mentioned that Melissa had gone on a few dates with a man she'd met at a coffee shop, but nothing serious. His name was Derek something. Angela didn't know his last name. Melissa had said he was nice but not really her type. That had been back in December. Angela didn't think Melissa had seen him again. Detective Campos asked for access to Melissa's phone records. The subpoena came through on Monday. The records showed that Melissa's phone had been turned off or had died at approximately 11:15 p.m. on Thursday, January 18th. The last call she had made was to her mother at 7:03 p.m., their usual Sunday call, but on Thursday because Barbara had mentioned she'd be busy that weekend. The call lasted 22 minutes. Barbara said Melissa had sounded normal, happy. They had talked about a sale at Nordstrom and whether Melissa should come home for a visit in March. After that call, Melissa had sent 3 text messages. One to Angela at 7:30, "Don't wait up watching a movie." One to a coworker at 8:15, "Can you cover my shift Saturday if I cover yours next week?" And one to an unknown number at 9:47, "Sorry, I'm not interested. Please don't contact me again." Detective Campos focused on that last message. She ran the unknown number through the department's databases. It came back registered to a prepaid phone purchased at a 7-Eleven on East Colfax, paid for in cash. No name, no records, a dead end. The search expanded. Officers went door to door at the Parkview Gardens complex. Most residents hadn't noticed anything unusual on Thursday night or Friday morning. One woman on the third floor said she'd heard a car alarm around midnight, but that wasn't uncommon. A man who lived directly below Melissa and Angela's apartment said he'd been out of town for work and hadn't been home all week. Volunteers from Melissa's church and coworkers from Nordstrom organized search parties. They walked the nearby parks, checked dumpsters, distributed flyers with Melissa's photograph. A young woman with shoulder-length brown hair, hazel eyes, a shy smile. The flyers asked, "Have you seen Melissa Hoover? Missing since January 19, 2001. The local news picked up the story. Channel 7 aired a segment on Tuesday evening. Barbara Hoover appeared on camera, her voice steady but her hands trembling. "Someone knows something," she said. "Please, if you've seen my daughter, if you know anything at all, call the police." Detective Campos reviewed the evidence methodically. Melissa's bank account showed no activity after Thursday afternoon, when she had withdrawn $40 from an ATM near her apartment. Surveillance footage from the ATM showed Melissa alone, wearing jeans and a gray sweater, at 3:21 p.m. She had walked away toward the north, out of the camera's range. There were no cameras at the Parkview Gardens complex. No doorbell cameras, no security system. Detective Campos requested footage from businesses along Colfax Avenue, the main thoroughfare near the complex. A gas station 2 blocks away had a camera that faced the street. The footage was grainy and the time stamp unreliable, but Detective Campos watched hours of it anyway. She saw dozens of people walking past, cars pulling in and out, but no clear sign of Melissa. Clear's throat. Deputies whispered quietly among themselves about the details that didn't add up. If Melissa had left voluntarily, why leave her coat in January? Denver nights dipped below freezing. If she had been taken by force, why was there no sign of struggle? The apartment was undisturbed. Nothing broken. Nothing missing except Melissa herself. Detective Campos returned to the text message sent at 9:47 p.m. "Sorry, I'm not interested. Please don't contact me again." The phrasing suggested someone had been bothering her. But who? And why hadn't she mentioned it to Angela or her mother? The investigation turned to Derek, the man Melissa had dated briefly. Through Melissa's coworkers, Detective Campos learned his full name, Derek Pullman. He was 28, worked in IT, lived in a rented house in Aurora. Detective Campos and her partner, Detective Raymond Torres, drove to his address on Wednesday morning. Derek Pullman answered the door in sweatpants and a t-shirt. He looked genuinely confused when the detectives introduced themselves and explained why they were there. He invited them inside without hesitation. His house was messy but not alarming. Dishes in the sink, laundry on the couch, a gaming console hooked up to a large TV. He said he'd gone on 3 dates with Melissa back in December. She was nice, he said, but they didn't have much in common. He hadn't contacted her since mid-December. He seemed surprised to learn she was missing. Detective Campos asked where he had been on Thursday night and Friday morning. Derek said he'd been home playing video games online with friends. He offered to show them his computer logs, his chat history, anything they needed. He provided the names and contact information for the friends he'd been gaming with. His alibi checked out. The friends confirmed he'd been online from 9 p.m. Thursday until 2 a.m. Friday. Derek Pullman was ruled out as a suspect. The investigation slowed. Days became weeks. Melissa's face appeared on lampposts and bulletin boards across Denver, but no credible leads emerged. The Denver Police Department classified her as a missing, endangered adult. Barbara Hoover stayed in Denver for 3 weeks before she had to return to Kansas for work. Before she left, she held a press conference outside the police station. The cameras captured her exhaustion, the dark circles under her eyes, the way her voice cracked when she said, Melissa is out there somewhere. Someone took my daughter from me. Please, please help us find her. By March, the case had gone cold. Detective Campos kept the file on her desk. She reviewed it every few weeks, hoping something new would surface. But Melissa Hoover had vanished as completely as if she'd never existed at all. Part 3. The silence in the years that followed. The absence of Melissa Hoover became a kind of presence in Denver. A ghost story people told when they talked about safety, about the randomness of violence, about how someone could be there one moment and gone the next. Barbara Hoover returned to Kansas but called Detective Campos every month, sometimes every week. "Anything new?" she would ask. The answer was always the same. Angela Chen moved out of the Parkview Gardens apartment in April 2001. She couldn't stand living there anymore, couldn't stop imagining Melissa's ghost moving through the rooms. She moved to Boulder, changed jobs, tried to put distance between herself and that terrible January morning. But she thought about Melissa constantly. At night, she would wake from dreams where Melissa was calling for help, her voice muffled and far away. The apartment where Melissa had lived was rented to new tenants, then new tenants again. The complex repainted the exterior in 2003, replaced the railings in 2005. Life moved on in the way it always does, swallowing up tragedy and continuing forward. For those who have ever doubted someone you love, who have felt the creeping suspicion that something is wrong but cannot name what it is, the years after Melissa's disappearance were marked by a particular kind of silence. Detective Campos interviewed dozens of people who had known Melissa, and several mentioned, almost in passing, a man who used to hang around the Parkview Gardens complex. Not a resident, just someone who was there sometimes, sitting in his car, walking through the courtyard. One woman said she'd seen him talking to Melissa once, but she couldn't remember when or what they'd talked about. She couldn't even remember what he looked like. Average height, she said. Brown hair, maybe, ordinary. The description was too vague to be useful. Detective Campos filed it away with the hundreds of other small details that led nowhere. But in 2004, something shifted. A woman named Rachel Moore contacted the Denver Police Department with information about the Melissa Hoover case. Rachel lived in the Parkview Gardens complex in 2001, in the building adjacent to Melissa's. She had been interviewed briefly after Melissa's disappearance, but hadn't mentioned anything significant at the time. Now, 3 years later, she called Detective Campos and said, "I need to tell you about Marcus." Marcus Lyle had been Rachel's boyfriend in 2001. They'd lived together in the complex for about 8 months, from October 2000 to June 2001. Rachel said Marcus had been obsessed with Melissa. He would watch her from their window. He'd find excuses to be outside when she came home from work. Rachel had confronted him about it once and he'd laughed it off, said Melissa was pretty. What was the harm in looking? But Rachel said it was more than that. He knew Melissa's schedule. He knew she took the bus to work, knew what time she left in the mornings. Rachel said she'd seen Marcus outside Melissa's building late at night, just standing there, smoking cigarettes and staring up at her window. Rachel said she didn't mention any of this in 2001 because she and Marcus had been together then, and she'd convinced herself it was nothing. But after they broke up in June, after she'd had time to think about it, she'd started to wonder. She said Marcus had been different in the weeks after Melissa disappeared. Quieter. He stopped going out as much. He'd moved out of the complex suddenly in July, said he needed a fresh start. Detective Campos asked why Rachel had waited 3 years to come forward. Rachel said she'd been scared. Marcus had a temper. He'd never hit her, but he'd punched walls, thrown things. She said she tried to put it all behind her, but she kept thinking about Melissa, about her mother on TV begging for information. Finally, Rachel said, her conscience wouldn't let her stay silent anymore. Detective Campos ran Marcus Lyle's name through the system. He had a record, a DUI in 1998, an arrest for disorderly conduct in 2002. Nothing violent. But Detective Campos found his current address and drove to his apartment in Lakewood, a suburb west of Denver. She knocked on his door on a Tuesday afternoon in September 2004. Marcus Lyle was 31 years old, tall and wiry with thinning brown hair. He answered the door with a guarded expression. When Detective Campos explained why she was there, his face didn't change. He invited her inside. The apartment was small and tidy. A couch, a TV, a bookshelf with. Marcus sat on the couch and folded his hands in his lap. Detective Campos asked him about Melissa Hoover. Marcus said he remembered her. Pretty girl. Lived in the same complex. He'd seen her around but never really talked to her. Detective Campos asked if he'd ever approached her, ever tried to talk to her. Marcus said maybe once or twice in passing. Small talk. Nothing more. Detective Campos asked where he'd been on the night of January 18, 2001. Marcus stared at her for a long moment. Then he said, "That was almost 4 years ago." "How am I supposed to remember that?" She asked if he'd kept any records from that time. Phone bills, receipts, anything that might show where he was. Marcus said no. He'd moved several times since then, thrown most of that stuff away. Detective Campos asked why he'd left the Parkview Gardens complex so suddenly in July 2001. Marcus said his lease was up. He wanted a change. She asked if he'd owned a prepaid cell phone in early 2001. Marcus said he didn't remember. Maybe. He'd had a few phones over the years. Detective Campos left that day without any hard evidence, but she felt the prickle of suspicion that came from someone being too calm, too careful with their words. Marcus Lyle had answered every question, but he'd given nothing away. Those who knew him said he'd always been like that. Private. Hard to read. Detective Campos added Marcus Lyle's name to the list of persons of interest in Melissa Hoover's disappearance, but without physical evidence or a witness placing him near Melissa on the night she vanished, there was nothing she could do. The case remained cold, clear as throat. Years passed. Detective Campos retired in 2010. The Melissa Hoover case was transferred to Detective Anthony Rivera, who reviewed it periodically but found no new leads. Barbara Hoover called less frequently, though she never stopped hoping. In 2015, on the 14th anniversary of Melissa's disappearance, she held a small vigil in Denver. A handful of people attended. Angela Chen, now living in California but willing to fly back, a few former coworkers, some members of Melissa's church. They lit candles and released balloons and said prayers for a woman who had been gone half her life. Marcus Lyle moved to Colorado Springs in 2012. He worked as a building maintenance supervisor, lived alone, kept to himself. If he thought about Melissa Hoover, he never mentioned it to anyone. And then, in the summer of 2023, everything changed. Part 4. The revelation. In June 2023, a woman named Olivia Grant was cleaning out her late mother's storage unit in Aurora, Colorado. Her mother, Patricia Grant, had died 3 months earlier at age 72 after a long battle with cancer. Olivia was sorting through boxes of old paperwork, photographs, kitchen supplies her mother had saved for no apparent reason. At the bottom of one box, beneath a stack of yellowed newspapers, Olivia found a small black notebook. It was the kind of notebook someone might use for a journal or to keep notes. Olivia opened it. The notebook belonged to Patricia's neighbor from the early 2000s, a man named Marcus Lyle. Patricia had apparently found it or been given it at some point, and for reasons Olivia couldn't understand, had kept it. The notebook contained dated entries, most of them mundane, grocery lists, work schedules, phone numbers. But several pages near the middle were different. They contained detailed descriptions of a woman, her routines, the times she left for work, the routes she walked, the way she wore her hair. The entries were dated from November 2000 through January 2001. One entry, dated January 18, 2001, read, "Tonight, can't wait anymore, she'll understand eventually." Another entry, dated January 19, 2001, read, "It's done. Easier than I thought. Took her to the place we talked about. She didn't struggle much. Said she'd go with me if I left her roommate alone. Loyal to the end. Disposed of everything at the site. No one will find it. Finally free. Olivia Grant called the Aurora Police Department immediately. The notebook was turned over to the Denver Police Department's cold case unit the next day. Detective Rivera opened the Melissa Hoover file and read the entries with a growing sense of disbelief and horror. The descriptions in the notebook matched Melissa Hoover. The dates matched. The handwriting would need to be analyzed, but if this was real, if this was Marcus Lyle's handwriting, it was a confession. Detective Rivera worked quickly. He obtained a warrant to search for handwriting samples from Marcus Lyle's employment records. A forensic document examiner compared the handwriting in the notebook to Marcus's known writing. The analysis came back positive. The handwriting matched. On September 12, 2023, Detective Rivera and a team of officers drove to Marcus Lyle's apartment in Colorado Springs. They executed a search warrant and arrested Marcus Lyle on suspicion of kidnapping and first-degree murder. Marcus's reaction was unnervingly calm. He didn't resist. He didn't ask questions. He simply said, "I want a lawyer." The search of Marcus's apartment turned up more evidence. In a locked filing cabinet, investigators found newspaper clippings about Melissa Hoover's disappearance. They found photographs of the Parkview Gardens apartment complex. They found a map of Colorado with a location circled in red ink, deep in the mountains west of Denver, near an area known for old mining claims and dense forest. On September 15th, a search and recovery team hiked to the marked location. The terrain was rough, the forest thick with pine and scrub oak. It took them 6 hours to reach the spot. There, in a shallow ravine covered by years of fallen leaves and undergrowth, they found human remains. The remains were incomplete, scattered by animals over 2 decades, but enough remained for identification. Dental records confirmed what everyone already knew. They had found Melissa Hoover. The discovery made national news. Barbara Hoover, now 68 years old, flew to Denver. She stood beside Detective Rivera at a press conference and said, through tears, "After 22 years, I can finally bring my daughter home." Marcus Lyle was formally charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and tampering with physical evidence. His attorney argued that the notebook was circumstantial, that it had been out of Marcus's possession for years and could have been tampered with. But the forensic evidence was damning. Soil samples from Marcus's old work boots, kept in storage, matched soil from the burial site. Fiber evidence from the remains matched fibers found in Marcus's car, which he had kept all these years. A 1998 Honda Accord that he'd told friends he couldn't bear to part with because it had sentimental value. The case went to trial in April 2024. The prosecution presented the notebook, the forensic evidence, and testimony from Rachel Moore, who described Marcus's obsession with Melissa. The prosecution also presented evidence that Marcus had purchased a prepaid cell phone on January 15, 2001, 4 days before Melissa disappeared. Cell tower records, subpoenaed after his arrest, showed that the phone had been used to call and text Melissa's number multiple times in the days before her disappearance. The final text, sent at 9:30 p.m. on January 18th, had prompted Melissa's response, "Sorry, I'm not interested. Please don't contact me again." Marcus Lyle did not testify in his own defense. His attorney argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that Marcus had been wrongfully accused. But the jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. On May 3, 2024, Marcus Lyle was found guilty on all counts. At sentencing, the judge called the crime a calculated and cruel act of violence. Marcus Lyle was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He showed no emotion as the sentence was read. Barbara Hoover attended every day of the trial. On the day of sentencing, she read a victim impact statement. "My daughter was 24 years old," she said. "She had her whole life ahead of her. Marcus Lyle took that from her. He took it from me. He took it from everyone who loved her, but he didn't take her memory. Melissa was kind. She was hopeful. She believed in the goodness of people. That's what I choose to remember. Angela Chen, now living in Seattle, released a statement saying, "I think about Melissa every day. I think about the life she should have had. I'm grateful that her family finally has answers, but no sentence can bring her back." The community response was divided. Those who had known Marcus Lyle expressed shock. Neighbors in Colorado Springs said he'd been quiet, polite, never any trouble. One woman said, "He helped me carry my groceries once. I can't believe he did this." Others said they'd always sensed something off about him, something cold behind his eyes. The case of Melissa Hoover is a reminder that justice, though sometimes delayed, can still arrive. For 22 years, her family lived with questions that had no answers. For 22 years, Marcus Lyle walked free while Melissa lay in an unmarked grave in the Colorado wilderness. But the truth, as it often does, found its way to the surface. Melissa Hoover was more than a victim. She was a daughter, a friend, a young woman with dreams. She deserves to be remembered not for how she died, but for how she lived, with kindness, with hope, with the simple belief that the world could be good. If this story mattered to you, subscribe and hit the bell. Share the episode. Someone somewhere may still be waiting to be heard.